Preparing for a business intelligence at HCA Healthcare interview? You've reached Candy Mentor, and this video is for you. We'll walk through 25 key questions you're likely to face. For each question you'll see a sample answer followed by the key points to cover. Subscribe, like, and share, and drop a topic request in the comments. Question 1. How would you design a data warehouse schema for hospital analytics? A star schema separates measurable facts from descriptive dimensions. I would model encounters, patients, providers, facilities, and dates as dimensions, with the grain explicitly defined, such as one encounter or claim line per row. That supports admissions, length of stay, and readmissions without double counting. I would use surrogate keys, conformed dimensions, and carefully governed measures. The trade-off is storage duplication, but reporting speed and usability improve. While answering, explain fact and dimension tables, grain definition, encounters, admissions, procedures, dates, providers, facilities, surrogate keys, conformed dimensions, and preventing double counting. Question 2. How would you calculate hospital readmission rates in SQL? I would first identify eligible index discharges, then use a self-join or window function to find the same patient's subsequent admission within the defined period, commonly 30 days. I would exclude planned readmissions and invalid or transferred encounters according to the business definition. The denominator includes only qualifying discharges, while the numerator includes qualifying readmissions. I would validate totals with clinical stakeholders before publishing the metric. Make sure to cover index admissions, qualifying readmission windows, exclusions, patient and facility attribution, denominator rules, date logic, duplicate encounters, null handling, and validating results against clinical definitions. Question 3. How would you build a Power BI dashboard for hospital operations leaders? I would begin with stakeholder interviews to define decisions, not just charts. The landing page would show census, occupancy, emergency department wait time, length of stay, and readmissions, with facility and date filters. Drill-through pages could expose department and provider detail. I would use clear targets, conditional formatting, tooltips, and accessible colors. Before release, I would test usability, performance, data accuracy, and role-based access. In your answer, discuss audience needs, KPI definitions, executive overview, drill-through, trends, filters, facility comparison, refresh expectations, accessibility, performance, security, and action-oriented design. Question 4. What is the difference between Power BI import mode and DirectQuery, and when would you use each? Import mode loads data into Power BI's in-memory engine, usually giving faster interactions and richer modeling. DirectQuery leaves data in the source, which helps with freshness or very large datasets but introduces source latency and workload concerns. I would prefer import for governed operational reporting with scheduled refresh, and DirectQuery when near real-time access is essential. Composite models and aggregations can balance freshness, performance, and scale. Be sure to mention in-memory performance, source system freshness, dataset size, query latency, transformation limitations, concurrency, governance, composite models, aggregation tables, and healthcare reporting requirements. Question 5. How would you optimize a slow Power BI report used across multiple hospitals? I would use Performance Analyzer to separate visual, DAX, and source query delays. Then I would reduce columns and cardinality, replace a flat model with a star schema, remove unnecessary visuals, and simplify expensive measures. I would verify query folding, add aggregations, and enable incremental refresh for historical data. Finally, I would monitor capacity and concurrency, because a report can be individually efficient yet collectively overload the environment. Focus on Performance Analyzer, model size, star schema, relationship cardinality, DAX efficiency, visual count, query folding, aggregations, incremental refresh, capacity monitoring, and identifying whether the source or report is the bottleneck. Question 6. What DAX measures would you create for occupancy rate and average length of stay? For occupancy, I would divide occupied bed days by available bed days, clearly distinguishing licensed, staffed, and unavailable beds. For average length of stay, I would divide total inpatient stay days by qualifying discharges, using the agreed treatment of same-day stays and partial days. I would implement both as explicit measures rather than calculated columns, preserve filter context, handle zero denominators, and reconcile results with finance or operations reports. Cover explicit measures, numerator and denominator definitions, date context, census versus licensed beds, discharged patients, partial days, filters, division by zero handling, and testing against authoritative hospital reports. Question 7. How would you use SQL window functions in hospital analytics? Window functions let me analyze records without collapsing the underlying rows. For each patient, I might use lag to compare an admission with the prior discharge, or row number to select the latest encounter record. Partition by patient and order by event time establish the clinical timeline. Running totals can show census trends by date. I would define tie-breaking columns and index partitioning fields to keep queries reliable and performant. Mention row number, lag, lead, running totals, partitioning, ordering, encounter timelines, latest record selection, readmissions, departmental trends, tie handling, and performance considerations. Question 8. How would you ensure patient data is protected in a BI solution? I would apply least privilege and expose only the minimum necessary data for each role. Patient identifiers should be masked or removed unless operationally required, while row-level security limits facility or department visibility. I would use encrypted connections, controlled workspaces, audited access, secure service identities, and governed refresh pipelines. I would also document data classification, retention, incident procedures, and validation with privacy and compliance teams. In your answer, discuss minimum necessary access, PHI and PE classification, row-level security, masking, de-identification, encryption, auditing, workspace roles, retention, secure development, and HIPAA-aligned governance. Question 9. Explain how you would implement row-level security in Power BI for hospital users. I would create a security mapping table containing user identity, facility, department, and permitted scope. A relationship would filter the model, with a dynamic role using USERPRINCIPALNAME to identify the signed-in user. I would avoid relying on hidden visuals or report filters because those are not security boundaries. Then I would test representative users, administrators, cross-facility cases, exports, and edge conditions before deployment. Be sure to cover roles, user-to-facility mapping tables, USERPRINCIPALNAME, dynamic security, relationship direction, testing, administrators, export risks, and ensuring security exists in the semantic model rather than only in visuals. Question 10. How would you reconcile conflicting definitions of patient volume across departments? I would not choose a definition based on convenience. I would document each department's business question, source fields, grain, inclusion rules, and timing. Then I would compare examples and quantify differences using reconciliation queries. Clinical, operational, and finance owners should approve the final definition, which belongs in a governed data dictionary. If multiple views remain valid, I would name them explicitly rather than presenting ambiguous patient volume. Discuss metric governance, grain, encounter versus visit definitions, numerator and denominator ownership, inclusion rules, data dictionary, stakeholder workshops, reconciliation queries, versioning, and publishing one certified definition. Question 11. How would you design an ETL pipeline for daily hospital reporting? I would extract incrementally using reliable timestamps or change tracking, land immutable data in staging, and transform it into validated warehouse tables. Each run would record batch ID, source counts, rejected rows, and processing times. Idempotent loads allow safe retries, while late-arriving dimensions receive controlled updates. Automated checks would compare totals, null rates, and referential integrity, with alerts and quarantine paths for failures. Cover source extraction, incremental loading, staging, transformations, data quality checks, slowly changing dimensions, orchestration, restartability, audit columns, failure alerts, reconciliation, and late arriving data. Question 12. How would you handle duplicate patient or encounter records in an analytics pipeline? I would first determine whether duplicates are genuine repeated events or ingestion problems. Stable source identifiers and encounter keys should drive deterministic deduplication. Fuzzy matching is riskier for patients and requires governed rules. I would retain raw records, assign a survivorship status, and log every decision. Before release, I would compare patient counts, encounter totals, and high-impact measures to ensure cleanup improves quality without removing legitimate clinical activity. Mention business keys, source system identifiers, matching rules, survivorship, deduplication timing, auditability, false positives, master data management, and validating that deduplication does not distort clinical or financial measures. Question 13. How would you analyze emergency department wait times and identify bottlenecks? I would define each interval from trusted event timestamps, such as arrival to triage, triage to provider, and arrival to disposition. Means alone can hide operational pain, so I would report median and high percentiles by facility, hour, acuity, and disposition. I would investigate missing or impossible timestamps, then map the process to locate bottlenecks. The dashboard should support staffing or workflow decisions, not merely rank hospitals. Focus on event timestamps, triage to provider and arrival to disposition intervals, percentile metrics, missing events, segmentation, process mapping, outliers, control charts, and translating findings into operational actions. Question 14. How would you measure hospital length of stay and investigate unusual variation? I would calculate stay duration from standardized admission and discharge timestamps, explicitly separating inpatient, observation, and same-day encounters. Because long stays skew averages, I would show median, percentiles, and outlier rates. I would stratify by diagnosis group, acuity, service line, facility, and discharge destination before comparing performance. Variation is a signal for investigation, not proof of poor care, so I would validate explanations with clinical leaders. Cover admission and discharge timestamps, same-day cases, observation status, median versus average, percentiles, case mix, exclusions, outliers, facility comparisons, and partnering with clinicians before attributing causes. Question 15. How would you validate a SQL query before using its results in an executive dashboard? I would begin by stating the metric grain and business rules, then inspect source rows and intermediate results. I would test joins for row multiplication, date boundaries, null timestamps, cancellations, transfers, and same-day events. Counts and totals should reconcile with an independent report or manual sample. A peer should review the SQL and assumptions. I would document test cases and retain validation evidence for future changes. Mention row counts, sample records, independent calculations, edge cases, joins, nulls, date boundaries, duplicate inflation, reconciliation to source reports, peer review, and documenting assumptions. Question 16. What would you do if a Power BI dashboard showed different numbers from the hospital's finance report? I would treat the discrepancy as a data quality issue, not immediately assume either report is wrong. I would compare refresh timestamps, filters, fiscal calendars, source tables, adjustment logic, and metric definitions. Reconciliation queries at facility and day level usually reveal where divergence begins. I would involve the finance owner, document the approved interpretation, correct the model or label differences clearly, and communicate the resolution before restoring trust. Discuss stopping publication, comparing definitions, refresh timing, source lineage, filters, fiscal calendars, adjustments, rounding, reconciliation queries, ownership, and communicating the resolution transparently. Question 17. How would you implement incremental refresh for large hospital datasets in Power BI? I would parameterize the date column with range start and range end and confirm the transformation folds to the source. The policy could retain several years while refreshing recent months or days, depending on correction patterns. I would include an overlap window for late arriving updates, then validate partition behavior and refresh duration in a test workspace. Monitoring should capture failures, duration, row counts, and capacity impact. Be sure to mention range start and range end, query folding, historical versus recent periods, refresh policies, late arriving corrections, partitions, data volume, testing, and monitoring refresh failures. Question 18. How would you make hospital dashboards accessible to clinical and non-technical users? I would design around the decisions users make during a shift, using plain labels such as average discharge time instead of unexplained abbreviations. Color should reinforce meaning and remain understandable without relying on red and green alone. I would provide definitions, tooltips, sensible defaults, keyboard and screen reader support, and focused drill-through pages. Testing with nurses, administrators, and accessibility users would expose confusing workflows before launch. Cover plain language labels, intuitive navigation, accessible colors, contrast, screen reader support, tooltips, definitions, mobile layouts, limited visual density, user testing, and avoiding misleading visualizations. Question 19. How would you troubleshoot a SQL query that suddenly became slow after a data increase? I would compare the current and previous execution plans and check whether data growth changed cardinality estimates or join choices. I would inspect indexes, statistics, predicates, spills, blocking, and resource weights. Functions on filtered columns and unnecessary transformations can prevent index use, so I would make predicates searchable where possible. After each change, I would measure runtime and logical reads, then consider partitioning or aggregation if growth is structural. Mention execution plans, statistics, indexing, cardinality changes, searchable predicates, parameter sensitivity, joins, partitioning, blocking, resource weights, and measuring improvements rather than guessing. Question 20. How would you analyze readmission risk while avoiding misleading conclusions? I would define the prediction or analysis cohort before examining outcomes and prevent leakage from post-discharge information. Results should account for case mix, missing data, facility differences, and important demographic or clinical factors. I would report calibration, confidence intervals, and subgroup performance rather than presenting a single ranking. Association does not prove causation, so clinical review and careful language are essential before operational decisions. Discuss cohort definition, leakage, confounding, missingness, risk adjustment, calibration, fairness, correlation versus causation, confidence intervals, clinical review, and responsible communication of uncertainty. Question 21. How would you monitor data quality for hospital analytics? I would define quality checks alongside each critical dataset: completeness for timestamps, validity for codes, uniqueness for encounter keys, consistency across systems, and timeliness against refresh SLAs. Failed checks should produce severity-based alerts, quarantine affected data, and identify an accountable owner. A quality scorecard can trend defects by source and facility. Lineage and remediation notes make recurring problems visible instead of silently hiding them. Cover completeness, validity, uniqueness, consistency, timeliness, referential integrity, threshold rules, anomaly detection, ownership, scorecards, alert severity, lineage, and remediation workflows. Question 22. Describe a time you would push back on a stakeholder's requested dashboard design. If a stakeholder requested a crowded dashboard with patient-level details for executives, I would first understand the decision they need to make. I would explain the privacy, usability, and performance risks, then prototype an executive summary with secure drill-through for authorized users. I would invite feedback and preserve essential requirements while removing noise. A respectful, evidence-based pushback usually produces a safer dashboard that gets used. In your answer, emphasize clarifying the decision, evidence-based recommendations, usability, privacy, metric integrity, prototypes, compromise, stakeholder empathy, and measuring adoption after delivery. Question 23. How would you compare performance across HCA Healthcare hospitals fairly? I would standardize definitions and verify denominator quality before comparing facilities. Raw rates can be misleading when hospitals differ in size, acuity, services, or case mix, so I would use appropriate stratification or risk adjustment. I would show volume, uncertainty, and peer groups alongside the metric, not just a rank. Comparisons should identify learning opportunities while avoiding punitive conclusions based on unstable or incomplete data. Mention consistent metric definitions: facility size, service mix, acuity, case mix adjustment, denominator stability, confidence intervals, peer grouping, data completeness, and avoiding simplistic league tables. Question 24. How would you design a near real-time hospital census dashboard? I would first confirm the operational decision and required freshness. A 5-minute view may be sufficient without stressing clinical systems. I would use a fit-for-purpose replicated source, DirectQuery or streaming only where necessary, and display the last successful refresh prominently. The model should distinguish current census from finalized historical counts. I would add caching, outage behavior, security controls, reconciliation jobs, and alerts for stale or implausible data. Be sure to cover event latency, source impact, DirectQuery or streaming choices, data freshness indicators, reconciliation, caching, failure behavior, security, operational thresholds, and the difference between current state and historical reporting. Question 25. How would you explain a technical buy finding to a hospital executive? I would lead with the decision-relevant finding, for example, that discharge delays increased on weekday afternoons and affected bed availability. Then I would quantify the change, explain the comparison period, and show the evidence without technical jargon. I would recommend a specific next step, state important limitations, and offer a drill-through for questions. Executives need clarity and confidence, not an impressive query, so I keep the narrative actionable. Focus on the business question, concise headline, impact, confidence, comparison, root cause evidence, recommended action, limitations, privacy, and offering detail only when requested. If you are still with us, congratulations, you are much ahead of the rest and serious about preparing for your interview. We hope we were able to add value to your preparation and create some helpful content. Do not forget to like and share this video. Your small act can do great things for us.